Hiya folks, it's Kikoskia here and welcome back to Writing and Me. This video contains no gameplay or music whatsoever, allowing you to focus on whatever it is you're up to, whether it's writing, playing games, listening to music, working, or looking at that button in front of you and thinking that you should press it. Now I know what you're expecting me to say. You're expecting me to tell you not to press that button. Well, I'm not going to do that. Feel free to press that button. Oh, but not like that. Oh dear. Don't panic. You've just set off a series of events that will eventually reset the universe in 2 minutes. Now, I know that sounds bad, and it is. The universe will collapse in on itself and be reformed, being almost exactly the same, but subtly different in ways that you can't quite grasp. I have a solution, though. For me. I have back there a thing that I'm just backing into, and now I'm in. I've closed the door. You can hear me through the speaker, and this is going to isolate me from the effects of the universe resetting. I'm sorry, there's only room for me in here. It was expensive enough to make a thing for me. Don't worry, you'll be absolutely fine. The universe will reset, and it will be just as everything was before, except not, as I said. But you won't notice that. I'll notice that. And it will bug me forever, because I will notice all the tiny little differences, but it will be absolutely fine. Just don't run away when you see the fabric of reality in the universe collapsing in on itself, because let's face it, it's collapsing in on the point where that button is. There is nowhere for you to run. It's best just to wait it out. So, see you in 2 or so minutes? Actually, it's a little less than 2 or so minutes right now, but I'll see you then. Okay? Okay. That aside, let's talk about editing. Specifically, drafts of your work. Editing at a basic level is going over your writing, making changes and correcting mistakes. And every piece of writing, fiction or non, goes through multiple drafts before it is declared complete. How many? That entirely depends on who's doing the editing and what they want to change. Sometimes a piece of work needs only 1 draft, sometimes it needs 5, sometimes it needs 16. But each draft serves the same purpose: refining the work and getting it closer to what the author wants it to be. As a general rule, before we go through any of the specifics about editing, save your previous drafts. Always save them. Keep a copy of each one so that you can always consult them later. In the worst case scenario, you can go back to a previous draft if you don't like how the one you're working on is going. It's always best to leave earlier versions of your work there so that you have a fallback in case something goes wrong, and you have things that you can consult when you are going through the editing process to make sure you're getting things right. The last thing you want to do while you're editing is to add more things in that you'll end up going over and removing because you didn't intend to add them in the first place. What are you looking for when you are editing? That question is very specific for each author because everyone is looking for different things. But in the most general of terms, there are things that most people will be searching for when they're going over the first draft of their work, working on the second, or if they're going over the 5th draft, working on the 6th, and so on. The first thing you'll be looking for are errors in spelling and grammar. These are the thing that you will have inevitably missed as you're going through, even with a spell checker. Spell checkers are not perfect. They will only look for words that are spelt incorrectly. If you put a word that is spelt correctly in the wrong place, it won't bring that up, though sometimes it will bring it up as incorrect grammar. That's not always the case, though, and so you going over your work with a fine analytical eye will hopefully catch some of those spelling and grammar mistakes, giving you an opportunity to change them. You won't find all of them, of course. That is where having somebody else edit your work, be it a professional editor or someone you trust, is a good idea, because they can find mistakes that you won't find, and highlight them for you. The key word here is highlight them for you, because sometimes what may be perceived as a spelling or grammar mistake actually isn't, and you intentionally wrote it like that. For instance, somebody could misspell things generally as a character, or the grammar actually makes sense in the setting, considering how things are described by characters or how somebody talks. The second thing you want to be looking for are plot holes. This is something that you would not have been able to have seen as easily while you were working through a story on the first draft. This is something specific to fiction writing, and something that is very important. You want to try your best to make sure that you don't have plot holes, that is, things that really don't make sense in the progression of the plot. A reader gets there and goes, "Wait, how does that work?" Or, "Well, that doesn't make any sense, considering this and that and this." Plot holes that are discovered tend to break the immersion somewhat, and you don't want to have them there. Finding them, of course, is very tricky, but it is easier when you are working on a second or third or fifth draft. You go through a story, knowing the flow completely and knowing where it will end, and you get to the plot points and you think, does this make sense? And if it doesn't make sense, then you need to change it. You either need to add in explanations that make it make sense, or you need to rewrite the event so that it then works. It is important that you make the events in a plot work, and going over your work will help in making sure it all adds up. You do want it all to add up. Note that changing a plot point to fill in a plot hole will have ramifications on things later on. It will have a ripple effect that will change other events, and that is something you're going to have to make a note of. Once you fill in a plot hole, get a notepad file or a physical notepad and write down that you need to watch out for certain points in the story that your change will impact. You should generally do that actually when you're editing. Make a note of all the things you intend to change and all the things that you actually change, and keep those in mind as you're moving forward. Speaking of changing things, you may want to add things into the story. Ideas that you had later on while you were writing or after you finished your draft that you want to slot in. And this could be plot points, these could be characters, these could be places, or certain bits of narrative that explain other things or generally provide world building. Adding things in is no bad thing, if you feel like its insertion is warranted and will enhance your story. That said, most drafts end up shortening the length of a story. Not by much most of the time, but they do end up making it shorter. How? We'll get to a little bit later. I personally have always strived to make my stories a little shorter when editing. Of course, if you do things the opposite way, as in your story is scant on details to begin with, and then you flesh things out in the second and third draft and make it longer, by all means do that. As I've said many a time before in these videos, you do what works for you. If you add all the details in later in the future drafts, keep doing that. If it works, it works. I'm speaking in more general overtones here about how editing tends to make things shorter. The next thing you may want to do is you may want to change things that are currently in the story. That is different from adding in that you are not having something completely new in, but you are looking at an event or characters or places or a plot point and you're thinking, this needs to be different. Maybe you know the character better now that you've written all the way to the end of the story and seen their character be fleshed out more. Maybe it's a place that's been fleshed out more, that there are more things of interest that you can mention and more characters within that place that need describing, and generally more time in the story dedicated to that location. Or maybe a plot point isn't working quite as you want it to. Different from a plot hole, you want to tweak it a little bit rather than completely plug in something that doesn't make sense. And by all means, do what you need to do there. Again, these changes are going to have an impact on later parts in the story, and you want to make a note of these things to make sure that you don't end up adding more things you need to edit later by forgetting that you've made these alterations. This is typically what you're going to end up doing when you're editing. Looking at the stories, characters, plot, places, and making alterations to make it more what it needs to be. With all these changes, however, you will end up with sections of a story that no longer have a place in the narrative. It may be a character who is no longer encountered, it may be a small plot arc that never occurs, or it may be a place that is never visited. These things are orphaned from the narrative, and they need to be removed. You may have an emotional attachment to these things that are no longer a part of the flow of the story, but don't let that stop you from doing what you need to do and separating them and taking them out. Now, you're not going to delete these forever, you're not going to permanently wipe them out of existence because you're saving your previous drafts, and you have those things that you have removed there. They're there so that you can consult them later and potentially insert them again at a point that works better. That character that you really like that you can't have here, maybe you can have them in a future story or a different story in the same setting, or you can transplant that character into a completely different setting, albeit with some changes to make sure they fit. The hard work was already done by you the first time round, and because you kept a record of it, that makes it simpler. Removing things and making the changes to things that already exist are the two things that will make your story shorter. I can't say exactly how many less words you have, but I'm pretty sure when I did my most recent major edit of my story, I shaved off about 40,000 words from my story, and I was quite happy with that result, because the story flowed better, and that is something that ultimately I'm striving to achieve personally with every edit I do. I want the story to flow as well as it can. That doesn't mean to say that the story is always at a steady pace. There are slower parts, there are frantic parts, and there are bits where it plods along at an average speed. What I'm saying is that the parts that I have left in, the parts that I have added, and the parts that I have taken away, all work to give the story that pace that feels natural to read. And that's the main thing that I'm going for. I go for that above sorting out errors in spelling and grammar. I go for that above adding new things. I go for it even above sorting out plot holes, though I always strive to find plot holes. If I find a plot hole, it's a priority to fix it. But if I haven't found that, but the story has a great flow, I'm happy. Because a story that has a great flow is very easy to read, and it will help draw the person that's reading it into the story. Somebody that's really immersed in it and is engaged with the narrative and the characters and the plot, they will overlook things like errors in spelling and grammar, and they may not even notice that plot hole that you missed because you have fine-tuned the draft so that the story is shorter and better to the point that it just moves the person on to turn the next page. With all of that said, I can't emphasize enough how drastic the effects of editing can be on a story. I've mentioned it a few times already, but I have to say it again. You can end up after a few drafts with a story that is so completely unlike what you started with that you will look at the most recent draft and the first one, and you will wonder if it was written by the same person. You may even be tempted to look at these changes and start fighting against them, thinking, no, I'm veering too far away from the first draft, I can't do that. I must stick to the first draft above all else. And I'm here to tell you, fight that urge, and edit as you need to. Not only are those changes things that you have seen from looking at the completed story, but quite often your changes will come about because you have more experience in writing. You have more experience in writing that setting, those characters, and in general, and you will apply that newfound knowledge to your draft, and you will see things that you did not see before. And those things may be things you want to change. Making new drafts and editing your work is a good thing, and you should fight the urge to not do it. But that has a caveat, and the caveat is that there will come a time when you are looking at your draft and you think, there isn't really anything I can change here anymore. I've done a couple of drafts and I've made some changes, and I'm happy with this now. If you're happy with it, don't make any more edits. If you are deep down satisfied and you can't find anything else to change, leave it be. Leave the thing alone and don't make any more changes. Don't go through it looking for more spelling and grammar errors. Don't go through it trying to pick out any little thing that you think is wrong. Doing that risks you changing things for the worse. Looking for mistakes that aren't there, fixing things that don't need to be fixed, and over-engineering your writing to the point that you edit to its detriment. Editing is fine. But when you feel that you don't need to do any more, stop. Don't second-guess yourself. Don't third-guess yourself. Stop. If you want more editing to happen, at that point, hand it over to somebody else to look at, be it somebody that you trust or a professional editor. They will be able to look at it with fresh eyes, eyes that did not write the work that is in front of you, and they will be able to see things that you did not. Whether you decide to take that stuff that they say on board is another matter, but it's better at that point to have somebody else look at it than you to keep tinkering at it forever and end up with something that is not only completely unrecognizable, but something that is unfortunately unreadable because you have over-engineered it into destruction. I unfortunately have done that with a few pieces of work in the past, and I look at those pieces of work with sadness. Most of them I have the previous drafts for, which means I can, if I choose to, go back to those and use them as a springboard to make a better edit of it, but there are a few very early things that I don't have the initial drafts for. I look at what could have been and look at what is and think, if I wanted to go back to this, I would have to rewrite the whole thing again from scratch. All the stuff that I have before in the in that edit that I completely botched, I have, through my desire to make it perfect, as it were, ruined it. And that reminds me of one thing I need to say to you. No piece of writing, fiction or no, is perfect. There will always be mistakes. There will always be little things that are missed. And far be it from things that ruin the work, those things are things that make it what it is. Those things are what make it your work. Your little mistakes that you add in are as much you as the things that you get right. And they are a thing that will be with you for your entire life. You will always end up making mistakes. It is just a part of being human to make errors. Through errors, we learn. We strive to improve. And while we'll never be perfect, we will do our best to do what we can to get closer to that unattainable goal. And while I'm thinking about that, if you read somebody's book and you find a spelling or grammar mistake, and you encounter that author, do not mention it to them. Because if you go up to them and say, "Hi, I read your book," and they go, "Oh, that's great," and you say, "Oh, on page 289, you said this, you put this word down instead of this word," they will go away from that thinking, "So you read my entire book, and the only thing that you can comment on about it is that there is a spelling mistake. Gee, thanks for that. I really wanted to know that that's the main thing that you focused on." Don't say that. Let me speak from experience here and say to you that I don't need anyone else to tell me all the mistakes in my story, full of holes and spelling mistakes and everything else, because I'm thinking that all the time, whenever I'm writing, whenever I'm editing, or whenever I'm thinking about it. I don't need to be reminded of it by somebody else who read it, and that was the only thing they took away from it. I'd much rather hear about what you liked than the fact that I accidentally put a comma on page 24 that wasn't meant to be there. That's much more something I'd want to hear. Certainly would make me a lot happier. And with that, I believe I've gone over the basics of editing. How you decide to do that editing is ultimately up to you. I've just provided the things you might want to look for, and I leave you to figure out your routine for doing it. However you decide to do it, I encourage you to always strive to edit your work and make it what you want it to be. It not only will be a better read, but you will also ultimately be happier with it, provided you don't go too far with the editing. Trust your gut in knowing when you have edited enough, and it'll be fine. And so, when we come back, folks, we will focus on another aspect of writing, specifically what you end up doing after you have finished your story. Working on the next one. And so, I'll catch you next time, folks, and I'll see you then. Later.